For some minutes after the cook had left the forecastle, Augustus abandoned himself to despair, never hoping to leave the berth alive. He now came to the resolution of acquainting the first of the men who should come down with my situation, thinking it better to let me take my chance with the mutineers than perish with the thirst in the hold, for it had been 10 days since I was first imprisoned, and my jug of water was not a plentiful supply even for 4. As he was thinking on this subject, the idea came all at once into his head that it might be possible to communicate with me by the way of the main hold. In any other circumstances, the difficulty and hazard of the undertaking would have prevented him from attempting it, but now he had, at all events, little prospect of life, and consequently little to lose. He bent his whole mind, therefore, upon the task. His handcuffs were the first consideration. At first he saw no method of removing them, and feared that he should thus be baffled in the very outset. But upon a closer scrutiny, he discovered that the irons could be slipped off and on at pleasure, and with very little effort or inconvenience, merely by squeezing his hands through them. This species of manacle being altogether ineffectual in confining young persons, in whom the smaller bones readily yield to pressure. He now untied his feet, and leaving the cord in such a manner that it could easily be readjusted in the event of any persons coming down, he proceeded to examine the bulkhead where it joined the berth, and the partition here was of a soft pine board, an inch thick, and he saw that he should have little trouble in cutting his way through. A voice was now heard at the forecastle companion, and he had just time to put his right hand into its handcuff, the left had not been removed, and to draw the rope in a slip knot around his ankle. And when Dirk Peters came below, followed by Tiger, who immediately leaped into the berth and lay down. The dog had been brought on board by Augustus, who knew my attachment to the animal and thought it would give me pleasure to have him with me during the voyage. He went up to our house for him immediately after first taking me into the hold, but did not think of mentioning the circumstance upon his bringing the watch. Since the mutiny, Augustus had not seen him before his appearance with Dirk Peters, and had given him up for lost, supposing him to have been thrown overboard by some of the malignant villains belonging to the mate's gang. It appeared afterward that he had crawled into a hole beneath a whaleboat, from which, not having room to turn around, he could not extricate himself. Peters at last let him out, and with a species of good feeling which my friend knew well how to appreciate, had now brought him to the forecastle as a companion, leaving at the same time some salt junk and potatoes, with a can of water. He then went on deck, promising to come down with something more to eat on the next day. When he had gone, Augustus freed both hands from the manacles and unfastened his feet. He then turned down the head of the mattress on which he had been lying, and with his penknife, for the ruffians had not thought it worthwhile to search him, commenced cutting vigorously across one of the partition planks, as closely as possible to the floor of the berth. He chose to cut here because, if suddenly interrupted, he would be able to conceal what had been done by letting the head of the mattress fall into its proper position. And for the remainder of the day, however, no disturbance occurred, and by night he had completely divided the plank. It should here be observed that none of the crew occupied the forecastle as a sleeping place, living all together in the cabin since the mutiny, drinking the wines and feasting on the sea stores of Captain Barnard, and giving no more heed than was absolutely necessary to the navigation of the brig. The circumstances proved fortunate both for myself and Augustus, for had matters been otherwise, he would have found it impossible to reach me. As it was, he proceeded with confidence in his design. It was near daybreak, however, before he completed the second division of the board, which is about a foot above the first cut, thus making an aperture quite large enough to admit his passage through, and with facility get to the main o'ertop deck. Having got there, he made his way with but little trouble to the lower main hatch, although in so doing he had to scramble over tiers of oil casks piled nearly as high as the upper deck, there being barely room enough left for his body. Upon reaching the hatch, he found that Tiger had followed him below, squeezing between two rows of the casks. It was now too late, however, to attempt getting to me before dawn, as the chief difficulty lay in passing through the close stowage in the lower hold. He therefore resolved to return and wait till the next night, and with this design he proceeded to loosen the hatch, so that he might have as little detention as possible when he should come again. No sooner had he loosened it than Tiger sprang eagerly to the small opening produced, and snuffed for a moment, and then uttered a long whine, scratching at the same time as if anxious to remove the covering with his paws. There could be no doubt from his behavior that he was aware of my being in the hold, and Augustus thought it possible that he would be able to get to me if he put him down through. He now hit upon the expedient of sending the note, as it was especially desirable that I should make no attempt at forcing my way out, at least under existing circumstances, and there could be no certainty of his getting to me himself on the morrow, as he intended. After events proved how fortunate it was that the idea occurred to him as it did, for had it not been for the receipt of the note, I should undoubtedly have fallen upon some plan, however desperate, of alarming the crew, and both our lives would most probably have been sacrificed in consequence. Having concluded to write, the difficulty was now to procure the materials for so doing. An old toothpick was soon made into a pen, and this by means of feeling altogether between, for the decks were as dark as pitch, and paper enough was obtained from the back of a letter, a duplicate of the forged letter from Mr. Ross. This had been the original draft, but the handwriting not being sufficiently well imitated, Augustus had written another, thrusting the first, by good fortune, into his coat pocket, where it was now most opportunely discovered. Ink alone was thus wanting, and a substitute was immediately found for this by means of a slight incision with the penknife on the back of a finger just above the nail, a copious flow of blood ensuing, as usual, from wounds in that vicinity. The note was now written, as well as it could be in the dark and under the circumstances. It briefly explained that a mutiny had taken place, that Captain Barnard was set adrift, and that I might expect immediate relief as far as provisions were concerned, but must not venture upon making any disturbance. It concluded with these words: I have scrawled this with blood. Your life depends upon lying close. This slip of paper being tied upon the dog, he was now put down the hatchway, and Augustus made the best of his way back to the forecastle, where he found no reason to believe that any of the crew had been in his absence there. To conceal the hole in the partition, he drove his knife in just above it and hung up a pea jacket which he found in the berth. His handcuffs were then replaced, and he also had the rope around his ankles. These arrangements were scarcely complete when Dirk Peters came below, very drunk, but in excellent humor, and bringing with him my friend's allowance of provision for the day. This consisted of a dozen large Irish potatoes roasted, and a pitcher of water. He sat for some time on a chest by the berth, and talked freely about the mate and the general concerns of the brig. His demeanor was exceedingly capricious and even grotesque. At one time, Augustus was much alarmed by his odd conduct, and at last, however, he went on deck, muttering a promise to bring his prisoner a good dinner on the morrow. During the day, two of the crew, they were harpooners, they came down, accompanied by the cook, all three in nearly the last stage of intoxication. Like Peters, they made no scruple of talking unreservedly about their plans, and it appeared that they were very much divided amongst themselves as to their ultimate course, agreeing in no point except that the attack on the ship from Cape Verde Islands, which they were in hourly expectation of meeting, as far as could be ascertained, the mutiny had not been brought about altogether for the sake of booty. A private pique of the chief mate against Captain Barnard having been the main instigation. There now seemed to be two principal factions among the crew, one headed by the mate and the other by the cook. The former party were for seizing the first suitable vessel which should present itself, and equipping it at some of the West India Islands for the piratical cruise. The latter division, however, which was the stronger, and included Dirk Peters amongst its partisans, were bent upon pursuing the course originally laid out for the brig into the South Pacific, there either to take whale or act otherwise as circumstances should suggest. His representations, who had frequently visited these regions, had great weight, apparently with the mutineers, wavering as they were between half-engendered notions of profit and pleasure. He dwelt on the world of novelty and amusement to be found among the innumerable islands of the Pacific, on the perfect security and freedom from all restraint to be enjoyed, but more particularly on the deliciousness of the climate, on the abundant means of good living, and on the voluptuous beauty of the women. As yet, nothing had been absolutely determined upon, but the pictures of the hybrid line manager were taking strong hold upon the ardent imaginations of the seamen, and there was every probability that his intentions would be finally carried into effect. The three men went away in about an hour, and no one else entered the forecastle all day. Augustus lay quiet until nearly night. He then freed himself from the rope and irons and prepared for his attempt. Bottle was found in one of the berths, and this he filled with water from the pitcher left by Peters, storing in his pockets at the same time with cold potatoes. To his great joy, he also came across a lantern with a small piece of tallow candle in it, and this he could light at any moment, as he had in his possession a box of phosphorus matches. When it was quite dark, he got through the hole in the bulkhead, having taken the precaution to arrange the bedclothes in the berth so as to convey the idea of a person covered up. And when through, he hung up the pea jacket on his knife, as before, to conceal the aperture. This maneuver being easily effected, as he did not readjust the piece of plank taken out until afterwards. He was now on the main orlop deck and proceeded to make his way, as before, between the upper deck and the oil casks to the main hatchway. Having reached this, he lit the piece of candle and descended, groping with extreme difficulty among the compact stowage of the hold. In a few moments he became alarmed at the insufferable stench and the closeness of the atmosphere. He could not think it possible that I had survived in my confinement for so long a period, breathing so oppressive an air. He called my name repeatedly, but I made him no reply, and his apprehensions seemed thus to be confirmed. The brig was rolling violently, and there was so much noise in consequence that it was useless to listen for any weak sound, such as those of my breathing or snoring. He threw open the lantern and held it as high as possible, and whenever an opportunity occurred, in order that, by observing the light, I might, if alive, be aware that succor was approaching. Still, nothing was heard from me, and the supposition of my death began to assume the character of certainty. He determined, nevertheless, to force a passage, if possible, to the box, and at least ascertain beyond a doubt the truth of his surmises. He pushed on for some time in a most pitiable state of anxiety, until at length he found the pathway utterly blocked up, and that there was no possibility of making any farther way by the course in which he had set out. Overcome now by his feelings, he threw himself among the lumber in despair and wept like a child. It was at this period that he heard the crash occasioned by the bottle which I had thrown down. Fortunate indeed was it that the incident occurred, for upon this incident, trivial as it appears, the thread of my destiny depended. Many years elapsed, however, before I was aware of this fact. A natural shame and regret for his weakness and indecision prevented Augustus from confiding to me at once what a more intimate and unreserved communion afterward induced him to reveal. Upon finding his further progress in the hold impeded by obstacles which he could not overcome, he had resolved to abandon his attempt at reaching me and to return at once to the forecastle. Before condemning him entirely on this head, the harassing circumstances which embarrassed him should be taken into consideration. The night was fast wearing away, and his absence from the forecastle might be discovered, and indeed would be necessarily so if he should fail to get back to the berth by daybreak. His candle was expiring in the socket, and there would be no greatest difficulty in retracing his way to the hatchway in the dark, except it would be impossible. It must be allowed, too, that he had every good reason to believe me dead, in which event no benefit could result to me from his reaching the box, and a world of danger would be encountered to no purpose by himself. He had repeatedly called, and I had made him no answer. I had been now 11 days and nights with no more water than that contained in the jug which he had left with me, a supply which it was not at all probable I had hoarded in the beginning of my confinement, as I had every cause to expect a speedy release. The atmosphere of the hold, too, must have appeared to him, coming from the comparatively open air of the steerage, of a nature absolutely poisonous, and by far more intolerable than it had seemed to me upon my first taking up my quarters in the box, the hatchway at that time having been constantly open for many months previous. Add to these considerations that of the scene of bloodshed and terror so lately witnessed by my friend, his confinement, privations, and narrow escapes from death, together with the frail and equivocal tenure by which he still existed, circumstances all so well calculated to prostrate every energy of mind, and the reader will be easily brought, as I have been, to regard his apparent failing, falling off in friendship and in faith with sentiments rather of sorrow than of anger. It would be severe. The crash of the bottle was distinctly heard, yet Augustus was not sure that it proceeded from the hold. The doubt, however, was sufficient inducement to perform, and he clambered up nearly to the orlop deck by means of the stowage, and then, watching for a lull in the pitchings of the vessel, he called out to me in as loud a tone as he could command, regardless for the moment of being overheard by the crew. It will be remembered that on this occasion the voice reached me, but I was so entirely overcome by violent agitation as to be incapable of reply. Confident now that his worst apprehensions were well founded, he descended with a view of getting back to the forecastle without loss of time. In his haste, some small boxes were thrown down, the noise occasioned by which I heard, as will be recollected. He made considerable progress on his return when the fall of the knife again caused him to hesitate, and he retraced his steps immediately and clambered up the stowage to a second time, calling out my name loudly as before, having watched for a lull, and this time I found voice to answer. Overjoyed at discovering me to be still alive, he now resolved to brave every difficulty and danger in reaching me. Having extricated himself as quickly as possible from the labyrinth of lumber by which he was hemmed in, he at length struck into an opening which promised better, and finally, after a series of struggles, arrived at the box in a state of utter exhaustion.